and he had just one child, a daughter, that he loved very much. And it bothered him to think that, you know, he didn't want his business to pass out of the family when he passed away, but he wanted his daughter to be married to a nice, kind gentleman, you know, someone who was worthwhile and would treat her well. So he was sort of actively searching amongst all of the young men who came to the mill. Unfortunately, he wasn't actually asking his daughter her opinion of these young men, but he was vetting them for, you know, good manners, proper respect for the father-in-law, fairly basic work ethic, and all of these things. And he finally settled on someone who he thought was just the right candidate. This young man was well-spoken, he was polite, he was bringing in grain fairly frequently to be ground into flour. You know, so he was a decent farmer, you know, I thought, you know, and could probably step well into the miller's role. And, you know, and it wasn't bad to look at least as much as a dad can judge these things. And he said to the young man, you know, would you be interested in perhaps, you know, courting my daughter and ending up with the inheritance of the mill someday? And I said, well, that's kind of hard to beat because amongst the other things, the miller's daughter was very great. She did not think so highly of him. He came courting, you know, week after week. He'd come back and talk with her, and he was always charming and polite and very sweet. But there was something about him that just didn't sit right. And her father asked her, you know, what's wrong with this guy? I mean, he's perfectly fine, you know, if you could come up with a reason of, you know, why you find him objectionable. And she's like, there's something about him. And he said, well, can you narrow it down? And she said, and because she couldn't really come up with anything concrete, and she didn't want to be rude before she knew what was happening, she was engaged. Well, the young man came into the mill one day with, you know, a load of wheat to be ground into flour, and he said to the girl, you know, you really got to come out and visit me. I mean, now that we're engaged, you should see your future house. And she said, well, I don't know where you live. He said, well, I live in the forest. You know, a good healthy walk in, but, you know. And she said, well, you know, I don't know if I could find your house. He's like, oh, the trail is very easy to find, and you just follow along. And she said, well, my sense of direction is very good. Well, he said, you know, tell me what, you can, I will scatter peas and beans along the whole path, so you will be able to find your way to my house. And then the girl was out of excuses, and she agreed that the very next day she would come to visit him. So the very next day, her father reminded her to put on her best dress, and put on her second best dress, and she started out into the forest, fully determined to tell her father that she couldn't find the path of peas and beans, that he was going to screw. But unfortunately, when she got to the end of the forest, there was the path, and there was the trail of peas and beans, and it was quite solid, and only an idiot could have totally missed it. And she realized that excuse wasn't going to fly. She walked along the path, and she walked, and as she walked, the trees got bigger and deeper and scarier and darker, and finally, after walking what seemed like forever and a day, but the peas and beans trail was still there, she came out into a tiny clearing, and there was a house. And the path ended, peas and beans ended at the front steps. It was not the kind of house that you want to think of as your future home. It was tiny, it was rickety, it was, you know, tumble down. The last time it had seen a coat of paint was, years before. The windows were all tiny and small, and they were crooked. And because there were two crooked windows on either side of a tiny, skinny, slot-like door. The girl looked at it, and it had the look of a horrible face kind of glaring at her. She didn't even want to knock on the door. But she knew if she got home and her father said, well, did you knock on the door? And she said, well, there didn't seem to be anybody home. He would at least ask if she had knocked on the door, and she would have to say no, she hadn't. So she marched up to the door and she gave it a brisk knock, and she heard a voice. And it said, turn back, thou bonny bride, nor in this house of death abide. That did not sound promising at all. In fact, it sounded distinctly creepy. But her knock had been brisk enough that the door sort of creaked open. She figured the latch was holding because window stairs and everything else about that house was slightly off and crooked. And the door swung open with a and right in the middle of the room was a huge bird cage, and in it was a parrot who stared at her and said, turn back, thou bonny bride, nor in this house of death abide. What a phrase for someone to teach their parrot, she thought. That's just awful. Well, the door was already open, so she hadn't opened it, and she figured, okay, I will holler in a quick hello, and if nobody answers, then I'm out of here. And she said, hello, is anyone home? And a little old woman came flying into the front room and said, my dear child, what are you doing here? She said, well, I was supposed to visit my fiance here, and I think I have the wrong house. And the little old woman said, well, are you the miller's daughter? And the girl said, yes. And she said, you poor child, your fiance is a robber and a cannibal, and he and his men work out of this house. I don't know how he tricked you into an engagement, but you had better run now. And the girl, that was all she needed to hear. She turned to run, and then they heard the hoofbeats coming up the path through the forest. And the little old woman said, it's too late, they're coming. I will hide you. And she rushed the girl down into the cellar and hid her behind a cask of wine. And the poor girl sat there shivering, trying to keep her teeth from chatter. And into the house roaring came her fiance and his terrible band of robbers. And they had a poor young woman with them who was crying and screaming, and they forced her to drink 3 kinds of wine, red, yellow, and white. And when she had drunk the third, she fell down dead. And they started searching her clothes and taking off her jewels and taking all of her valuables. And all the time, the miller's daughter was hiding behind the wine cask, staring at this terrible thing, wondering how she was going to possibly escape. Well, one of the robbers went to pull the last little ring off the girl's tiniest finger, and it couldn't move. It was stuck good and firmly. So he said a terrible word. He pulled out a hatchet, he chopped at the finger, and went flying up in the air, and it landed behind the cask in the miller's daughter's lap. And she sat there trying very hard not to scream. And the robber started to move towards it, and the little old woman said, what, do you think it's going to run away? Come on, supper's almost ready. You need to come. They did even more terrible things to that poor young woman. It involved more hatchets and a stew pot. And then the robbers ate, and they ate, and they ate, including her fiance, and they had the most terrible stories. They were telling each other about all of the people they had murdered, and the treasure they had stolen, and the people they had eaten. And then they drank, and they drank, and they drank, until they all passed out on the floor. The miller's daughter waited and waited and waited until all of them were snoring and seemed heavily asleep. And then, taking the finger very carefully, she dropped it in her pocket and crept out amongst all of the bodies of the passed out robbers on the floor. She hiked her skirts up, and there was no room to walk between them. She had to step over each one. She thought she was going to throw up. Finally, she got to the stairs. She went up into the house. She flew out the front door, which was still standing open, and found that so many hours had passed that it was the middle of the night. It was a dark night with no moon. There was only the faintest bits of star gleamed above her. And she thought, oh no, it's so dark and there's so many paths through the woods. If I try to, I'm going to get lost. Now this is the place in this particular story where there is only one small piece of magic which kind of qualifies it as a fairy tale. But some kind, goodly wood spirit had caused the peas and the beans to grow into full plants in the course of a few hours. And so even though there were only tiny bits of starlight coming down through the trees and the leaves, the girl could see the plants perfectly well and followed them all the way home. There she crawled into bed and she shook until daylight came. Then she crawled out of bed, and now she had to figure out a way to tell her father about his ability to pick her a fiancé. I mean, what could you say about that visit, really? Yes, Dad, he invited me for dinner. She thought and she thought and she thought. She couldn't think of anything that wouldn't be crazy, implausible sounding, or weird, or nuts. And she was trying to come up with some way to explain it coherently, and she didn't want to tell her father at some time that he was alone. She was like, he's got to have a lot of people around so that we'll have protection if the robber bridegroom comes back. And she was thinking about it. She couldn't come up with a good way to tell him, and the wedding was scheduled for just a week away. Well, she was still trying to think of it when finally, on the day of the wedding, she came up with an idea. To celebrate, after the wedding ceremony, everybody was in a grand feasting hall. And as was the custom, people were going around the various tables and telling stories and jokes. And when it came to her, she said, you know, I can't think of any stories right now, but I can tell you about a dream I had. The wedding guests sounded interesting, so she said, well, you know, I dreamed that I was walking along in the woods, and I came to a house, and it was tiny and tumble down, and it had two crooked windows and a skinny little slot door so that it looked like an angry face. And her bridegroom started, and she said, I know it sounds creepy, but it was only a dream. She said, I went in the house, and there was this parrot on the first floor that said, turn back, thou bonny bride, nor in this house a death abide. And her bridegroom started to turn a little pale. And she said, but it was only a dream. She said, then a little old woman came out and told me that my husband-to-be was a robber and a cannibal and an eater of people. And he was coming right then, so she had to hide me. And she hid me behind a wine cask, and he made a movement. He's like, surely this is too terrible a story to be telling at a dinner feast. And she said, oh, but it was only a dream. She said, and then they came in with a young woman who they killed with poison wine. And they went to rob her body of all of her jewels, and they couldn't get a ring off her littlest finger. So they chopped at it with a hatchet, and it flew up behind the wine cask and landed in my lap, and she pulled out of her pocket, and she said, and here is the finger. And the bridegroom turned sheet white, jumped out of his chair, and started to take off running. But there were enough wedding guests that they tackled him And they took him straight down to the biggest tree beside the Miller stream, and they hung him by the neck until he was dead. Now, after this, the Miller decided to get a little more input onto choices for his daughter's fiancé. And they all managed to live about as happily ever after as most folks do. And that is the story of the Robert Bradford.